Every holiday, my parents found a new excuse to leave me home so they could spoil my sister instead. The last time they did it, they left my Thanksgiving plate on the porch like I was a stray animal driving off to a luxury dinner without me. That night, I packed my things, moved across the country, and never told them where I went. 9 years later, they walked into my 3 Michelin star restaurant and demanded a free meal, completely unaware they were speaking to the owner. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. Trust me, you will want to hear how I served them the ultimate reality check. 9 years ago, I was 22 years old and exhausted in the absolute best way possible. It was 4 in the morning on Thanksgiving Day, and the kitchen of our family home in Atlanta was already my personal sanctuary. I was a culinary student, pouring every ounce of my heart and passion into the one thing that made me feel visible in a house where I was constantly overlooked and diminished. Food was my love language. It was how I proved my worth to people who refused to see me. I stood over the stove carefully, basting a massive heritage turkey. The rich and intoxicating scent of roasted rosemary, toasted garlic, and browned butter filled every corner of the room. On the counter, my sweet potato pies were cooling perfectly, their crusts flawlessly fluted by hand. I had spent my entire meager grocery budget from my draining part-time job just to buy premium organic ingredients for this specific meal. I wanted to impress them. I wanted, just for once, for my mother Yvonne and my father Marcus to look at me with the same unbridled pride and affection they reserved exclusively for my older sister Chantel. Growing up in the Washington household meant adhering to a very strict and suffocating image of Black excellence, or at least my mother's deeply flawed and superficial version of it. My parents valued country club memberships, expensive designer labels, and jobs that sounded prestigious when they bragged at cocktail parties. Chantel fit their mold effortlessly and perfectly. She was studying corporate law, always wore her hair in sleek, straight silk presses, and carried herself with a manufactured haughtiness that my mother deemed refined and elegant. I was the exact opposite in every conceivable way. I loved working with my hands. My clothes always smelled faintly of roasted spices and wood smoke, and I proudly wore my natural hair in thick, untamed coils. To my parents, my culinary aspirations were little more than domestic servitude. They saw my intense passion as a fundamental failure to elevate myself in society. But that morning, as I meticulously arranged the candied yams and the slow braised collard greens, I convinced myself that this spectacular feast would finally bridge the massive gap between us. I truly believed that when they tasted the profound love and effort I poured into every single dish, they would finally see me as a real chef, as a creative artist, and as someone worthy of a seat at their table. I had no idea that my labor of love was about to be weaponized against me in the most cruel way possible. By noon, the house was immaculate, and the formal dining room table was set with our best china. I was wiping down the kitchen counters when the heavy front door swung open, bringing a gust of cold November air and the booming, entitled voice of my soon-to-be brother-in-law, Bryce Sterling. Bryce was 36, a wealthy white man from a highly prominent old money family in Savannah. He worked in high-stakes venture capital, drove a luxury car that cost more than my entire culinary school tuition, and possessed a specific brand of arrogance that only generations of unchecked privilege could buy. Chantel glided into the foyer behind him, draped in an expensive cashmere coat, looking like she had just stepped out of a luxury fashion catalog rather than coming home to visit her own family. Bryce took one slow look around our modest foyer and let out a small, condescending chuckle that made my skin crawl. He always treated our home like a quaint little cultural exhibit he was touring for his own amusement. He made a grand show of wiping his expensive loafers on the welcome mat, loudly commenting on how surprisingly nice and quiet the neighborhood was for this particular side of town. It was one of his signature daily microaggressions, a subtle but sharp reminder that he viewed our world and our lives as inherently beneath his own. My parents rushed into the hallway to greet them, practically falling over themselves in their eagerness. My mother smoothed down her holiday dress, her voice jumping a full octave as she welcomed Bryce, acting far more like a starstruck fan than a dignified future mother-in-law. My father clapped Bryce heavily on the back, laughing a little too loud and a little too hard at whatever unfunny joke the arrogant man had just made. I stepped out of the kitchen, wiping my damp hands on my white chef apron. I offered a warm and genuine smile, announcing that the turkey was resting and the grand dinner would be ready to serve in exactly 30 minutes. Chantel slowly looked at me, her cold gaze traveling all the way from my flour-dusted canvas sneakers up to my natural hair, which was tied back in a large practical puff. Her upper lip curled in obvious distaste. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing or acknowledge the incredible smells coming from the kitchen. Instead, she turned directly to our mother and sighed loudly, showing her deep annoyance. "Are we really doing this right now?" Chantel asked, crossing her arms over her expensive coat. "We are supposed to be at the Sterling estate by 4 o'clock. Bryce's parents hired a highly exclusive private catering team for the evening. We absolutely cannot fill up on heavy home-cooked food before a legitimate high society dinner." My heart instantly dropped into my stomach, hitting the floor. I looked at my mother, desperately waiting for her to defend the beautiful meal we had planned together, the meal I had spent the last 8 grueling hours preparing with my own 2 hands. Instead, Yvonne nodded vigorously in agreement. Of course, my mother agreed, her voice dripping with eagerness to please. "We are just going to pack a few very small plates to take with us in the car. We would not dream of ruining our appetites for the prestigious Sterling family dinner." Bryce leaned casually against the doorframe, examining his heavy gold watch. He looked toward the kitchen and blatantly wrinkled his nose in disgust. "It smells a bit strong and overly seasoned in there, Kiara," he said. "You know my mother is very particular about strong food odors lingering on our clothes. We really should get going soon. Chantel, darling, are your parents ready to leave?" I stood there, completely paralyzed by the crushing realization that my entire Thanksgiving feast, the expensive ingredients, the sleepless night, the endless preparation, was being reduced to an inconvenient odor by this man. They had never actually intended to sit down and eat my food. They had simply used me as a convenient backup plan, a temporary placeholder, until Bryce's wealthy parents officially extended a dinner invitation. And now that the golden invitation had arrived, I was expected to simply pack up my culinary creations in cheap containers so they could casually snack on them during the car ride. I swallowed the hard, painful lump of betrayal forming thick in my throat. I slowly untied my apron, trying desperately to salvage whatever shred of dignity I had left in that hallway. "Fine," I said, keeping my voice as steady and calm as I possibly could. "If we are leaving for the Sterling estate right now, I just need 10 minutes to change out of my chef jacket and fix my hair. I will be right down." I turned toward the wooden staircase, but my mother stepped directly and swiftly into my path. Her hand shot out, pressing flat and hard against my chest to stop me from taking another step forward. The entire room suddenly went terrifyingly quiet. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" my mother asked, her tone dropping into a harsh, vicious, hushed whisper. "To change my clothes," I replied, genuine confusion mixing heavily with my rapidly growing panic. "For the Thanksgiving dinner at Bryce's parents' house. You just said we all need to be there by 4 o'clock. My mother let out a sharp, humorless laugh that cut me to the bone. She looked quickly over her shoulder to make sure Bryce and Chantel were engaged in their own quiet conversation near the front door, then leaned in uncomfortably close to my face. "You are not coming, Kiara," she hissed. "You are staying right here." The words felt like a physical blow to the stomach. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "I am part of this family. Chantel is my own sister." My mother's eyes narrowed, becoming cold, hard, and calculating. "The Sterling family is very traditional," she whispered venomously. "They are old Southern money. Chantel is marrying into a completely different world, a world of exclusive country clubs and wealthy boardrooms. We need to present a certain elite aesthetic to be accepted by them today. Look at yourself, Kiara. Look at your loud hair. Look at those cheap culinary school clothes. You do not fit in with these people. You will embarrass us." Hot tears burned the backs of my eyes, stinging fiercely, but I absolutely refused to let them fall and give her the satisfaction. "You are ashamed of me," I whispered, my voice breaking slightly. "You are ashamed of your own daughter because I am not a corporate lawyer, because I wear my natural hair and want to be a chef instead of a socialite. My father Marcus walked up quietly behind my mother. I looked to him for support, hoping and praying that the man who used to teach me how to ride a bike would see how deeply this rejection was breaking my heart. Instead, he cowardly refused to even meet my eyes. He looked down at the hardwood floor, nervously adjusting his leather belt. "Do not make a scene." Kiara, my father muttered, his voice lacking any real backbone or paternal protection. "Just take one for the team, all right? Your sister is securing a major financial future for this family by marrying Bryce. She desperately needs to score points with his parents today. Your whole attitude, your overall look, it is just too loud for them. Stay home, watch the house. It is just one dinner." Too loud. That was the exact coded phrase they always used when they really meant too black, too authentic, too completely unwilling to shrink myself to make wealthy white people comfortable. My own flesh and blood parents were entirely willing to erase my existence to appease an arrogant man who looked down on all of us. "We are leaving now," my mother announced loudly, pivoting away from me with chilling ease and pretending everything was perfectly fine. She walked briskly into the kitchen, and I heard the distinct sound of plastic snapping open. A moment later, she returned carrying a cheap, flimsy plastic Tupperware container. She shoved it roughly into my hands. "I packed you some of the turkey and greens. Eat it while it is warm. Make sure you lock the doors tonight." I stood frozen, holding the cheap plastic container, feeling the warmth of the food through the bottom. Through the large living room window, I watched my mother, my father, my sister, and her smug fiancé climb happily into Bryce's luxury SUV. They were smiling and laughing together. They looked exactly like a perfect, happy, wealthy family. And they were leaving me behind without a single backward glance. I walked slowly to the front door, opened it, and stepped out onto the cold wooden porch. The crisp, biting autumn air swept through my thin shirt, making me shiver. I looked at the container in my hands, then slowly, deliberately set the plastic Tupperware of cold leftovers down on the welcome mat. They had treated me exactly like a stray animal, tossing me pathetic scraps before driving off to live their real lives. I did not scream into the void. I did not chase desperately after the departing car. Instead, a profound, absolute, and terrifyingly calm clarity washed over my entire being. This was not a family. This was a calculated transaction, and I had just been permanently deemed a bad investment. That evening, while they were busy seeking the conditional approval of people who would never truly respect them, I walked back upstairs to my childhood bedroom. I methodically packed one single duffel bag with only my most essential belongings. I left my culinary jackets, the ones my mother hated so passionately, hanging untouched in the closet. I took the $400 I had diligently saved from tips in a glass jar under my bed. I walked out the front door, stepped right over that cold Thanksgiving plate sitting on the porch, and walked into the dark night. I changed my phone number the very next morning. I severed every single tie. I disappeared from their toxic world, completely taking all my loud, unpolished, and brilliant potential with me. As I boarded a bus out of the state, I promised myself one thing. The next time they saw my face, they would have to beg for a seat at my table. The bus ride away from Georgia was the longest and coldest journey of my life. I watched the city limits of Atlanta fade into the dark horizon, out the smudged window, and with it every expectation of who I was supposed to be. I had $400 a duffel bag and a completely shattered heart, but I also had something my family could never understand. I had relentless, unyielding grit. I ended up in Chicago, a city that did not care about my Southern pedigree or my mother's country club status. Chicago only cared about what I could bring to the table, and I brought fire. My first job was washing dishes in a cramped, brutally hot kitchen at a high-volume downtown restaurant. I worked 16-hour shifts, scraping burned food off heavy cast iron pans until my hands were raw and blistered. I slept on a lumpy mattress in a shared studio apartment with 3 other girls living off the rejected food from the restaurant. But I kept my eyes open and my mouth shut. I watched the line cooks. I studied the executive chef. I memorized flavor profiles and inventory lists. When a prep cook walked out in the middle of a Friday night rush, I stepped up to the cutting board and never looked back. Within 2 years, I was running that kitchen. Within 4 years, I had saved enough to buy a broken-down food truck. I painted it matte black and called it Obsidian. Obsidian was not just a food truck, it was a revelation. I took the deep, rich soul food traditions my mother had been so deeply ashamed of and elevated them using classic French techniques. I served oxtail consomme, black truffle macaroni and cheese and wagyu, short rib pot roast. People lined up around the block in the freezing snow just to taste my food. The truck turned into a small pop-up restaurant. The pop-up turned into a permanent brick-and-mortar location. Investors started noticing. Food critics started writing glowing reviews. But I remembered my grandfather's old sayings about ownership. I refused to sell my soul or my equity to outside investors who wanted to water down my vision. Instead, I built a supply chain. I started sourcing premium ingredients directly from Black-owned farms across the South, packaging and distributing them to other high-end restaurants. That was the true birth of the Obsidian Group. 9 years after my family left me freezing on the porch with a plastic box of leftovers, I returned to Atlanta, not as a prodigal daughter, but as a conquering queen. At 31 years old, I was the sole founder and executive chef of a hospitality and food supply empire valued at over $1 billion. I owned 12 luxury restaurants across the country, a massive commercial supply network, and prime commercial real estate in 4 different states. My crown jewel was Aura, a 3 Michelin star restaurant located right in the heart of Atlanta in the very same elite district my family used to desperately try to access. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the prep kitchen at Aura was humming with quiet, focused intensity. I stood at the stainless steel pass wearing a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit, with my thick natural hair styled in an elegant protective crown. I no longer wore the cheap culinary school jackets my mother had so deeply despised. The air smelled of seared duck breast, toasted coriander, and reduction sauces simmering to perfection. I was currently inspecting a plate of pan-seared scallops when Malik walked into the kitchen. Malik was 38 years old, sharp as a tack and fiercely protective. As the chief financial officer of the Obsidian Group, he was my right-hand man, and the closest thing I had to actual family. He wore a crisp navy suit and carried a sleek leather portfolio. He knew my entire history, the hungry nights in Chicago, the rejection from my parents, and the ruthless drive that fueled my every move. He matched my energy step for step. "We have the quarterly projections for the supply distribution division," Kiara Malik said, stepping up to the counter and opening his portfolio. "The new warehouse facility in Dallas is fully operational and coming in under budget by 4%. However, the real estate developers for the Miami expansion are trying to renegotiate the lease terms on the new restaurant space. They are asking for a higher percentage of the gross revenue." I did not even look up from the plate I was inspecting. I used a pair of precision tweezers to place a delicate microgreen on top of the scallop. "Tell them the deal is entirely off," I said calmly. "We do not renegotiate signed term sheets, and we certainly do not share gross revenue with landlords who try to squeeze us at the 11th hour. Pull our earnest money and contact the secondary location in Brickell. If they want Obsidian Group to anchor their new development, they will accept our original terms. We are the draw, Malik, not them." Malik smiled, a sharp, knowing expression that told me he already anticipated my answer. "Already done," he replied. I sent the termination email before I walked into the kitchen. The Brickell developers are thrilled and ready to fast-track our permits. Also, the legal team finished reviewing the acquisition papers for the boutique hotel chain in Nashville. We are cleared to transfer the $75 million to close the deal on Thursday. "Excellent," I said, finally stepping back from the plate and wiping my hands on a crisp linen towel. "Wire the funds tomorrow morning. I want that portfolio integrated into our system before the end of the month." This was my life now. Rapid-fire decisions involving millions of dollars executed with the same precise control I used to season a reduction sauce. I had built a fortress around myself constructed of flawless contracts, prime real estate, and undeniable culinary excellence. There was no room for error and absolutely no room for anyone who did not respect the empire I had built from the ground up. Malik flipped to the next page of his portfolio, his expression shifting slightly from purely professional to mildly amused. "I also have the reservation list for the main dining room tonight," he noted. "We are fully booked for the next 8 months as usual, but there is a particular party of 6 coming in for the 8 o'clock seating under a corporate account. I flagged it because the last name matched yours. I felt a tiny, imperceptible pause in my heartbeat, but my face remained an unreadable mask. A last name means nothing, I replied, keeping my voice entirely neutral. Half the city shares my last name, Malik. It is a common occurrence. Normally I would agree, Malik said, adjusting his glasses. But the corporate card on file belongs to a failed tech startup in Savannah, and the primary guest is listed as Bryce Sterling. He booked our exclusive chef tasting menu. The name hit the air like a drop of ice water in a hot skillet. Bryce Sterling, the arrogant old money fiancé. The man who had wrinkled his nose at my Thanksgiving turkey and treated my childhood home like a culturally impoverished petting zoo. If Bryce was here, that meant my sister Chantel was undoubtedly with him. They had actually managed to secure a reservation at Aura, completely unaware that the very establishment they were preparing to dine in was wholly owned and operated by the sister they had discarded like trash nearly a decade ago. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I looked down at the perfectly plated scallops, the flawless execution of ingredients that commanded hundreds of dollars per plate. I thought about the cheap plastic Tupperware containers sitting on a freezing wooden porch. I thought about my mother blocking the staircase, my father looking at the floor, and my sister wrapping her expensive cashmere coat around herself as they left me behind to seek the approval of the very man who was now coming to eat my food. "Is there a problem with the reservation?" Malik asked, watching my expression carefully. "Should I have the front of house manager cancel it due to a booking error?" We could easily cite a kitchen malfunction or an overbooked system. I shook my head, my smile sharpening into something dangerous and perfectly calculated. "Absolutely not, Malik," I said softly. "Keep the reservation exactly as it is. In fact, I want you to ensure they are seated at table 4 in the center of the main dining room. I want them to have the best view in the house." Table 4 was our most visible and prestigious seating arrangement. It was directly in the line of sight of the open-concept kitchen, where guests could watch the culinary team perform their synchronized choreography. It was the perfect stage for what was about to happen. Malik raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing the heavy gravity of the situation. "Table 4 it is," he said, closing his portfolio with a soft snap. "Do you want the kitchen to prepare anything special for them?" "Just the standard tasting menu," I replied, turning back to my prep station. "But make sure the floor staff gives them exactly the kind of service they demand. I want them to feel as important and entitled as they possibly can. Let them get comfortable. Let them feel like they own the room." I knew exactly how Bryce and Chantel operated. They fed on exclusivity and thrived on making service workers feel small. They would walk into my restaurant expecting to be treated like royalty, entirely blind to the reality that they were stepping directly into the jaws of a predator they had created. For 9 long years, I had focused solely on my own survival and success. I had never actively sought out revenge or tried to ruin their lives. I had simply outgrown them. But the universe had a dark sense of humor, delivering them right to my doorstep, demanding to be served. As Malik turned to leave the kitchen, I called out to him one last time, and Malik, I added, my voice echoing slightly against the stainless steel walls. "When they inevitably complain about something and demand to speak to the owner, come and get me immediately. I will handle table 4 personally." Malik nodded, a deep understanding settling in his eyes. "Understood, Kiara. I will have security on standby just in case." I spent the rest of the afternoon moving through my daily responsibilities with a chilling, laser-focused calm. I reviewed inventory spreadsheets, approved the marketing budget for our new locations, and finalized the seasonal menu changes for the upcoming quarter. Every decision was crisp, every action deliberate. I was no longer the frightened 22-year-old girl desperate for a shred of maternal validation. I was a titan of industry, a woman who controlled the livelihoods of thousands of employees and dictated the culinary trends of the entire region. As the evening approached, the energy in the restaurant shifted from preparation to execution. The main dining room of Aura was a masterpiece of modern luxury. Dark mood lighting illuminated the sleek obsidian stone tables, velvet curved booths, and dramatic towering floral arrangements. The ambiance was intoxicating, a perfect blend of high-end exclusivity and vibrant cultural celebration. It was a space designed to make people feel incredibly lucky just to be allowed inside the doors. At 7:45, I retreated to my private executive suite located just above the main dining room. I took a few minutes to refresh myself, brushing away the faint traces of kitchen work. I touched up my makeup, ensuring my appearance was absolutely flawless. I adjusted the collar of my designer suit, checking my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The woman looking back at me was powerful, intimidating, and completely untethered from the pain of my past. Downstairs, the dinner service was in full swing. The soft hum of sophisticated conversations and the clinking of crystal wine glasses drifted up through the floorboards. I sat at my mahogany desk, watching the live security camera feeds on my dual monitors. I had eyes on every single corner of the restaurant. At exactly 8 o'clock, the front doors of Aura opened. I leaned forward in my leather executive chair, my eyes fixed on the high-definition monitor displaying the host stand. There they were, Chantel and Bryce Sterling. Chantel looked remarkably the same, though perhaps a bit more strained around the edges. She was dripping in luxury brand logos, carrying an oversized designer bag that screamed new money and security. Her hair was still bone straight, but her posture lacked the effortless grace she used to project. Bryce had aged poorly. He looked heavier, his face slightly bloated, and his expensive suit seemed to fit him awkwardly, as if he had recently fluctuated in weight. He still carried himself with that same insufferable, arrogant swagger, pushing past other waiting guests to approach the host stand. I watched through the silent camera feed as Bryce spoke to my front-of-house manager, snapping his fingers impatiently and pointing toward the dining room. My manager, trained to handle the most difficult personalities with absolute grace, nodded politely and led them toward table 4. The game had officially begun. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers together, and watched the monitors with the cold, detached patience of a spider waiting for a fly to struggle. They were sitting at my table, drinking my wine and breathing my air. And they had absolutely no idea that the bill they were about to pay would cost them far more than just money. It was going to cost them their entire fragile, fabricated reality. I watched the monitor in my executive suite as the sommelier approached table 4 with a bottle of vintage reserve. Bryce waved him off with a flick of his wrist, a gesture so dripping with unearned superiority it made my jaw clench tight. Chantel was busy taking photos of the table arrangement, carefully positioning her designer bag so the logo would be visible in every single shot. She looked around the room, not to appreciate the stunning architecture or the sophisticated ambiance, but to assess whether the other diners were wealthy enough to warrant her presence. I could see her whispering to Bryce, pointing discreetly at a nearby table where a famous local athlete was dining quietly. She was soaking in the immense prestige of my restaurant, entirely oblivious to whose kingdom she had just walked into. Our service captain, Marcus, a brilliant young black man who had been with me since the early food truck days, stepped up to their table to introduce the tasting menu. I had trained Marcus myself. He knew the origin of every ingredient, the history of every technique, and possessed a dignified grace that no amount of money could ever buy. I turned up the audio feed on my monitor just in time to hear Bryce interrupt Marcus mid-sentence. Bryce leaned back in his velvet chair, loudly declaring that he did not eat organ meats and demanding the kitchen substitute the Wagyu beef cheek for a basic filet mignon. He also insisted that the chef prepare a specialized off-menu appetizer because his wife was on a strict new diet. Marcus smiled politely and explained that the chef-tasting menu at Aura was a carefully curated narrative experience and that the kitchen respectfully declined any substitutions to preserve the integrity of the dishes. Bryce's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of red. The polite refusal struck a massive nerve in a man who was used to bending the entire world to his whims simply by flashing a platinum credit card. I watched as Bryce actually snapped his fingers at Marcus, a sharp, degrading sound that cut right through the low, elegant hum of the dining room. He told Marcus that he was paying thousands of dollars for this dinner and that the kitchen staff worked for him tonight. He demanded that Marcus stop reciting scripted nonsense and go tell the cooks to do exactly what he asked. When Marcus maintained his perfect professional composure and reiterated our strict policy, Bryce completely lost whatever thin veneer of old money class he supposedly possessed. He slammed his hand flat on the table, causing the crystal glassware to rattle and the nearby guests to turn their heads. Chantel, instead of calming her husband down, looked at Marcus with the exact same expression of deep disgust she used to reserve for my culinary jackets. She added her own venom, telling Marcus that they were personal friends with the top food critics in the city and could easily have him fired for his blatant insolence. Bryce stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the polished floor, and demanded to see the general manager immediately. He shouted that the service was entirely unacceptable and that he wanted the person in charge to come out and apologize to his wife right this second. I stood up from my mahogany desk, smoothing the fine fabric of my suit jacket. It was time. I walked out of the executive suite and slowly descended the floating glass staircase that led down to the main dining room. The ambient lighting caught the sharp angles of my tailoring and the absolute confidence in my stride. I did not rush. I took my time, letting the quiet power of my presence ripple through the room before I even reached the main floor. As I approached table 4, the surrounding diners had gone completely quiet, watching the pathetic spectacle Bryce was creating. Malik was already standing a few feet away, keeping a watchful eye, but he stepped back silently as I entered the perimeter of the table. Bryce was still mid-rant, berating Marcus about the supposed lack of refined hospitality in Atlanta compared to his elite hometown of Savannah. I stepped smoothly in front of Marcus, placing myself directly between my loyal staff and this arrogant man. I looked Bryce up and down, taking in his flushed face and poorly fitted suit. "May I help you, sir?" I asked, keeping my voice low, calm, and carrying an unmistakable edge of heavy authority. "We seem to be experiencing a disruption in our dining room, and my staff has informed me that you are dissatisfied with our tasting menu policies." Chantel had been looking down at her phone, clearly annoyed by the delay in service, but at the sound of my voice, her head snapped up so fast, I thought she might injure her neck. Her eyes locked onto my face, and for 3 agonizingly long seconds, her brain simply refused to process the information it was receiving. She stared at my protective hairstyle, my flawless makeup, my expensive charcoal suit. She looked at the posture of a woman who completely owned the space she was standing in. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She blinked rapidly as if trying to clear away a hallucination. "Kiara," she finally breathed out the name, sounding like a dry gasp of air. Bryce stopped his angry rant and looked down at his wife in pure confusion. He then looked back at me, his brow furrowing deep as he tried to place my face. It had been 9 long years, and the last time he saw me, I was a flower-covered girl in cheap sneakers, being treated like the hired help in my own parents' house. It took him a long moment, but the recognition finally dawned in his eyes. He let out a loud, incredulous laugh. "Well, I will be damned." "Be damned," Bryce said, pointing a finger right at my face. "The runaway sister. What are the absolute odds of this? We come to the most expensive place in the city and you are here working the floor." Chantel finally recovered from her initial shock, but instead of feeling any sense of shame or showing any genuine happiness at seeing her sister alive and well, after nearly a decade, her deep-seated toxic nature kicked right in. The golden child complex flared up instantly, burning away any normal human decency. She looked me up and down, her eyes desperately searching for a flaw to exploit, a weakness to attack. When she found absolutely none, she simply invented one to protect her fragile ego. She leaned back in her plush booth, crossing her arms defensively. "So this is where you ended up," Chantel said, her voice dripping with the familiar condescension that used to make me cry in my childhood bedroom. "You ran away from the family, completely abandoned mom and dad, and vanished for 9 years just to become a restaurant manager. I mean, I guess it makes sense. You always did like hanging around in the kitchen and smelling like food. But honestly, Kiara, you could have at least let mom know you were alive instead of acting like a dramatic teenager looking for attention." I stood there, letting her toxic words wash completely over me. They did not burn anymore. They did not make me feel small or inadequate. They just sounded incredibly pathetic. Chantel was sitting in a restaurant where a single dinner cost more than she used to make in a week, and she was desperately trying to belittle the woman standing in front of her. She was actively trying to reestablish the old family hierarchy where she was the elegant, successful lawyer, and I was the inadequate culinary failure who did not deserve to sit at the same table as her white husband. Bryce smirked and leaned heavily on the table, acting as if my presence gave him a sudden massive advantage in his petty argument with my staff. "Well, since you work here, Kiara, maybe you can actually be useful," he said, his tone entirely dismissive and mocking. "Tell your stubborn waiter here to stop arguing with me and go tell the kitchen to make the substitutions I asked for. And frankly, given the family connection, I think you should absolutely comp our wine for the massive inconvenience. We have had a very long day, and we do not have time for this rigid restaurant policy nonsense from your staff." Chantel nodded vigorously in agreement, completely oblivious to the massive danger she was putting herself in. "Exactly," she said, waving her manicured hand at me as if swatting away a pesky servant. "And if you cannot authorize the changes yourself because you are just a manager, then go get the actual owner out here. My husband is a very important client in this city, and he is a VIP guest. We are not going to sit here and be treated like regular walk-ins just because my estranged little sister happens to be working the evening shift. Get someone with actual authority out here right now." I did not even have to speak. Before the silence could stretch into another demand, Malik stepped smoothly up to the table. His polished leather shoes made no sound on the floor, but his presence carried the weight of an executioner. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy metal credit card. It was the same exclusive black card Bryce had slapped onto the host stand 30 minutes earlier, demanding to secure a tab for his expensive wine. Malik held the card between his index and middle fingers, as if it were something contaminated. He did not hand it back to Bryce. Instead, he let it drop. The heavy metal card hit the polished obsidian stone table with a loud, sharp clack that echoed perfectly in the quiet dining room. Sir Malik said, his voice projecting just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear every single word. "Your card was declined 3 times by your financial institution. Furthermore, you seem to be deeply confused about the chain of command in this building. You are currently speaking to Kiara Washington, the sole owner, executive chef, and founder of the Obsidian Group. She does not report to a general manager. She owns the entire empire." The color drained from Bryce's face so rapidly he looked genuinely ill. He stared at the metal card sitting on the table and then slowly looked up at me. His mouth opened, but the arrogant, wealthy bravado that usually poured out of it had completely evaporated. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. Chantel physically recoiled, pressing her back hard against the velvet booth. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, looking at the crystal chandeliers, the impeccable waitstaff, the wealthy patrons, and finally back to me. The math was breaking her brain. The sister she had abandoned, the one she had just mocked for smelling like food, was the mastermind behind the most exclusive dining experience in the city. "Declined." Bryce finally stammered, his voice cracking in a way that destroyed his elite facade. "That is impossible. Run it again. Your machine must be broken. I am a sterling." "Our machines are functioning perfectly, sir," Malik replied without missing a beat. "I suggest you contact your bank regarding your insufficient funds. However, that will have to wait until you are off the premises. Miss Washington does not tolerate guests who disrespect her staff, regardless of their deeply flawed financial status." I looked down at Chantel, who was practically vibrating with a mixture of profound embarrassment and furious disbelief. "You wanted someone with actual authority." "Chantel," I said, my voice soft but cutting like shattered glass. "You have her. 9 years ago, you were too embarrassed to let me sit at your Thanksgiving table because I did not fit your elite aesthetic. Tonight, you are sitting at my table drinking my wine and disrespecting my people. And just like you did to me, I am going to ask you to leave. But I am not going to leave you a plastic container of leftovers on the way out." Bryce tried to salvage whatever pathetic shred of dignity he had left. He stood up, puffing out his chest, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "You cannot do this," he hissed, his face twisting with rage. "We are paying customers. Do you know who my family is? I will ruin this place. I will have the health inspector here tomorrow. I will destroy your reputation." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked him dead in the eyes with a level of cold, absolute power that made him hesitate. "Bryce," I said smoothly, "you could not even afford the appetizers you just ordered. You are standing in a building I own, free and clear. My security team is already standing behind you. You can either walk out of that front door right now, or you can be physically carried out in front of the local athlete you were just trying to secretly photograph. The choice is entirely yours, but your dinner is officially over. Bryce turned his head and realized that two of my massive security guards dressed in immaculate black suits had silently materialized directly behind him. The entire dining room was watching. There was no graceful exit. There was no way to spin this. Chantel grabbed her oversized designer bag, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the handles. Her face was flushed dark with the ultimate humiliation. She refused to look at me as she slid out of the booth. Bryce snatched his declined credit card off the table and shoved past Marcus, storming toward the front entrance. Chantel followed close behind him, keeping her head down, completely stripped of her golden child arrogance. They were escorted out of the glass doors and onto the busy Atlanta street, publicly banished from the kingdom they had tried to conquer. I smoothed my jacket, nodded to Marcus to clear the table, and walked calmly back up the floating glass staircase to my suite. The satisfaction was sweet, but I knew this was only the beginning. Chantel was not going to keep this a secret. She was going to call home. Word traveled exactly as fast as I anticipated. When a golden child faces a crushing defeat, they immediately run back to the people who built their pedestal. Chantel must have called our mother from the pavement outside the restaurant, sobbing about the humiliation and, more importantly, about the impossible wealth she had just witnessed. For 9 years, Yvonne and Marcus Washington had convinced themselves and their social circle that I was a tragic failure, a runaway daughter who could not handle the pressure of their elite expectations. Hearing that I was a billionaire sitting on top of a hospitality empire must have been a shock to their system. But shock quickly morphs into greed when you are dealing with vultures. Less than 48 hours later, the front desk of the Obsidian Group corporate headquarters alerted my office of a disturbance in the lobby. My headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek glass skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. It was a fortress of modern design featuring polished marble floors, original artwork from Black artists, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling city. Security protocol was incredibly strict. Nobody got past the lobby without an appointment. Malik walked into my office, his face set in a tight, grim line. "Security just called up from the ground floor," he said, standing before my massive oak desk. "Your parents are down there. They are causing quite a scene, demanding to be let up. Your mother is telling the lobby guards that she is the mother of the CEO and threatening to have them fired if they do not give her an elevator pass." I leaned back in my leather chair, staring out at the skyline. The audacity was almost poetic. After almost a decade of total silence, they smelled money and immediately flew across state lines, expecting to walk right into my life and claim a piece of my throne. "Send them up," I said, my voice completely void of emotion. "Have security escort them directly to my office. Do not offer them coffee or water." Malik nodded and tapped his earpiece, relaying the instructions. 2 minutes later, the heavy frosted glass doors to my executive suite swung open. My mother Yvonne walked in first, followed closely by my father Marcus. They looked older, but they were dressed exactly as I remembered, wearing expensive clothes that desperately screamed status. They stopped dead in their tracks as they took in the sheer magnitude of my office. The panoramic views, the custom furniture, the absolute undeniable proof of massive wealth. Yvonne's eyes widened, and for a split second I saw raw, calculating greed flash across her face before she quickly covered it up with a theatrical mask of maternal grief. She threw her hands over her mouth, forcing tears into her eyes, and rushed toward my desk. "Kiara," she cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Oh, my beautiful baby girl. Look at you. Look at what you have become. We have missed you so desperately. We have been worried sick for 9 years." She reached across the desk, trying to grab my hands, but I smoothly pulled them back, resting them on the armrests of my chair. I did not stand up. I did not smile. I just sat there looking at the woman who had barred me from a Thanksgiving dinner because my hair was too loud for her white son-in-law. "You have not been worried sick," I said, my tone flat and clinical. "You have not looked for me. If you had, you would have found me years ago. I have been on the cover of national business magazines. I am not hiding. You are only here because Chantel called you crying after her credit card bounced at my restaurant." Yvonne's fake tears vanished instantly. evaporating the moment she realized the weeping mother routine was completely useless against me. She dropped her hands and her posture stiffened, reverting immediately to the controlling matriarch she had always been. She looked around the opulent office, adjusting her designer silk scarf. "Well, you certainly have a flair for the dramatic, just like you always did," she said, her tone shifting from sorrow to casual entitlement. "Chantel was very upset, Kiara. You embarrassed your sister and your brother-in-law in public. That was completely unnecessary and very spiteful, but your father and I are willing to look past that. We are a family, and family forgives." My father stepped forward, trying to project the strong paternal authority he had completely failed to show 9 years ago. "Kiara," he said, using his deep, booming voice, "you have clearly done very well for yourself. It is impressive. But you should not hold grudges. The past is the past. We came all the way down here because it is time to bring you back into the fold. You are a Washington, and we need to stick together, especially now that you have these resources." I stared at him, letting the heavy silence stretch out until the air in the room felt suffocating. They barged into my multi-million-dollar headquarters after abandoning me, and within exactly 3 minutes, they had completely dropped the act. They were not here to apologize. They were not here to make amends. They were here because they wanted access to my resources. They wanted to take credit for the empire they had zero part in building. "The absolute audacity," I said, shaking my head slowly. "You really think you can walk in here and claim me after you treated me like a stray dog? You left a plastic container of cold food on the porch, Marcus. You told me to take one for the team so your other daughter could marry a racist, arrogant man who just tried to humiliate my black staff in my own restaurant." Yvonne slammed her hand on my desk, her true toxic colors shining brightly. "How dare you speak to your father that way," she snapped. "You should be thanking us. If I had not left you home that night, you never would have learned true independence. You owe this success to family tough love. We pushed you to be better, and look at the results. You are a billionaire because we gave you the motivation to prove us wrong. You owe us, Kiara." I let out a harsh laugh. "You are claiming credit for my trauma, Yvonne. You think your abuse was some sort of master class in entrepreneurship. You are delusional. You are only standing in my office right now because you smell money. But you are going to find out very quickly that my money is not for you." Marcus puffed out his chest, pointing a finger at me. "We are your parents. You have a duty to this family. Bryce is working on a massive tech expansion, and he could use a silent partner. With your capital and his connections, we could elevate this entire family to the next level. We came here to offer you a seat at the real table." They were circling like starving vultures, completely blind to the fact that they were trying to prey on an apex predator. They had no idea what was actually waiting for them in the dark. I looked at my parents, watching them stand in my office, pitching me a business deal to bail out the very man they had chosen over me. The sickness of their delusion was fascinating. They truly believed that after all this time, I would simply hand over my hard-earned empire just for the privilege of being accepted back into their toxic fold. They believed that blood gave them a blank check to my bank accounts. They had no idea that I had already unleashed Malik to dig into the Sterling family finances the moment Bryce tried to ruin my dinner service. They did not know that I already saw the massive cracks forming in their perfect elite facade. I was not going to simply throw them out of my office. That would be entirely too easy. I was going to let them believe they had won. I was going to let them walk right into a trap they built with their own greed. I pressed the intercom button on my desk, summoning Malik back into the room. The vultures were officially circling, but I was about to serve them a meal they would never forget. Malik stepped back through the heavy frosted glass doors, holding his sleek leather portfolio tightly against his side. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my parents, whose faces instantly morphed from aggressive entitlement back to a fabricated mask of polite superiority the moment my chief financial officer entered the room. "Send Bryce and Chantel up," I told Malik, my voice echoing slightly in the vast executive office. "They are waiting in the lobby, and I think it is time we have a complete family reunion." Malik nodded once, a sharp movement that conveyed his complete understanding of the battle lines being drawn, and turned to execute the order without a single word of hesitation. Yvonne immediately took his departure as a direct invitation to make herself entirely comfortable in my sanctuary. She walked over to one of the custom crushed velvet sofas in my seating area and gracefully sat down, crossing her legs at the ankles, exactly the way she had been taught in her expensive finishing classes. She patted the soft cushion next to her, motioning for Marcus to sit down beside her. He did so heavily, looking around the massive room as if trying to calculate the retail value of every single piece of original artwork hanging on my walls. The silence between us stretched out thick and suffocating, but I absolutely refused to be the first one to break it. "You know, Kiara," my mother finally began her tone, adopting a sickly sweet cadence that made the contents of my stomach churn violently. "You are looking at this entire situation all wrong. You have carried this ridiculous heavy grudge for 9 long years, thinking we punished you that night on Thanksgiving. But you really need to understand that leaving you on that freezing porch was the absolute greatest gift I could have ever given you." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany desk and interlaced my fingers. "A gift," I repeated softly, letting the single word hang heavily in the cold air of the office. "Yes, a gift," Yvonne insisted, leaning forward with intense manufactured sincerity radiating from her eyes. "If I had brought you to the Sterling estate that night, you would have deeply embarrassed yourself and our entire family. You were so naive, so unpolished, so aggressively committed to being less than what we needed you to be. You would have been eaten alive by those high society people. And more importantly, you would have stayed comfortable in my house, clinging to my apron strings, playing with your little pots and pans forever. I had to break your heart to build your character. Look at you right now, Kiara. You are a billionaire sitting in a glass skyscraper. You learned true independence because I actively forced you to learn it. You owe this massive success to family tough love." The sheer volume of her delusion was breathtaking to witness in person. She was actively trying to rewrite a traumatic moment of maternal abandonment into a masterclass of strategic parenting. She wanted to erase the hungry nights, the freezing Chicago winters, the sheer terror of being 22 and completely alone in the world. She wanted to claim the abundant harvest of a field she had completely refused to water. She was sitting in a building I bought with my own blood and sweat, and she was trying to convince me that her cruelty was actually a brilliant investment strategy. Marcus nodded vigorously beside her, adjusting his expensive tie to look more authoritative. "Your mother is exactly right, Kiara," he said, his chest puffing out with unearned pride. "We knew you had a strong fire inside you, but you desperately needed to be pushed out of the nest. We sacrificed our close relationship with you so you could eventually reach your full potential in the business world. It was a very heavy burden for us to bear, knowing you hated us all these years, but we did it entirely for your own good. Now that you have arrived at this impressive level of success, it is time to drop the juvenile anger and recognize what we really did for you." I stared at the two of them, letting the profound sickness of their words wash over me without changing my expression. They were not just lying to me, they were lying to themselves to protect their fragile egos. They desperately needed this twisted narrative to survive the crushing reality that the daughter they threw away had built an empire that dwarfed the combined net worth of their entire social circle. I did not scream at them. I did not throw them out of my office. I simply nodded slowly, letting them fully believe their toxic manipulation was actually working on my mind. Before Yvonne could continue spinning her elaborate web of lies, the heavy glass doors to my office swung open again. Chantel and Bryce walked in, and the energy in the room immediately shifted from delusional gaslighting to aggressive, overwhelming entitlement. Chantel had clearly spent the last 2 days recovering from the absolute humiliation she suffered in my restaurant. She marched into the office wearing a tight designer dress, carrying an oversized Birkin bag, like a physical shield against her own insecurity. She refused to look at the sweeping skyline views or the luxurious modern decor, choosing instead to focus her cold, calculating eyes directly on me. Bryce walked in closely behind her, and the arrogant swagger had fully returned to his posture. He had clearly managed to convince himself over the weekend that my 3 Michelin star restaurant and my billion-dollar hospitality group were simply a lucky fluke, a cute little culinary project that randomly took off. He carried himself with the supreme unearned confidence of a white man who had been told his entire life that he was inherently superior to everyone in the room, particularly a young black woman. He did not wait to be invited to sit down. He bypassed the velvet sofas entirely and walked straight up to my desk, placing both of his hands flat on the polished mahogany, leaning over to aggressively invade my personal space. "So this is the little food business you have been running," Bryce said, a condescending smirk playing on his thin lips. "I have to admit it is a very nice setup. Very flashy architecture. You have definitely done well for a catering gig, Kiara. But let us be completely honest here for a second. Running a few restaurants and managing a bunch of line cooks is child's play compared to real corporate business dynamics." I did not blink. I did not move away from his proximity. I just looked up at him, maintaining a completely unreadable professional expression. "A catering gig," I echoed softly, testing the immense weight of his absolute audacity. Bryce chuckled, a short dismissive sound that echoed through the quiet office. "Come on, Kiara," he said, waving a hand flippantly around the room. "You have some nice real estate and a trendy brand, but you are still just playing around in the service industry. You are selling dinners to people who have real money. I deal in the future. I deal in decentralized finance, cryptocurrency, and global tech infrastructure. My world is where the real money and the real power reside." Chantel walked up to stand right beside him, placing a highly supportive hand on his arm. "Bryce is working on something massive right now, Kiara," she said, her voice taking on that familiar haughty tone she used whenever she wanted to remind me of her perceived superiority. "He is launching a revolutionary crypto platform that is going to completely disrupt the global market. He already has major institutional players begging to get in on the ground floor before it goes public." I knew from Malik's initial intelligence report that this was a complete and utter fabrication. Bryce's tech startup was actively bleeding money from every department. He had horribly mismanaged investor funds, over-leveraged his personal assets to maintain a wealthy lifestyle, and was currently spiraling rapidly toward a catastrophic bankruptcy. But standing in my office, he projected the perfect illusion of a conquering hero, offering to save a helpless maiden from her own mediocrity. Bryce straightened his posture, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, arrogant flourish. "I am going to do you a massive favor, Kiara," he announced, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "Because you are technically family and because your parents asked me to personally look out for you, I am willing to let you in on this exclusive deal. I am opening up a special investment tier just for you today. $5 million. I raised a single eyebrow, allowing a tiny fraction of my amusement to show through my neutral mask. $5 million, I repeated slowly, letting the number hang between us. "It is an absolute steal," Bryce assured me, leaning back and crossing his arms over his chest. "I usually do not accept anything less than $10 million from my angel investors, but I am making a rare exception for family. In exchange for your $5 million, I will make you a minority stakeholder in the tech company. But much more importantly, I will give you something your restaurant money can never buy on its own. I will give you access." He paused for dramatic effect, clearly believing he was delivering the business pitch of a lifetime. "I will introduce you to the right people, Kiara. The old money families, the real power brokers, the people who actually run the economy of this country. You can serve them expensive dinners all you want, but until you are sitting at the table in their corporate boardrooms, you will always just be the help to them. Investing with me elevates you from a glorified cook to a legitimate player in high society." Yvonne immediately chimed in from the sofa, her eyes shining with greedy anticipation. "It is the opportunity of a lifetime, Kiara. Bryce is opening heavy doors for you that you could never open yourself, no matter how many restaurants you build. This is what real family does. We elevate each other to the next level. With his elite connections and your available capital, we can finally secure the Washington family legacy at the very top of the social ladder where we belong." Marcus nodded enthusiastically, adjusting his posture on the couch to look more supportive of the scam. "Exactly," he agreed loudly. "You have done very well with your little food project, but it is time to finally graduate to the big leagues. Bryce is handing you a golden ticket today. $5 million is a drop in the bucket for your company now, but it buys you a permanent seat at a table you could never access on your own merit." I sat in my executive chair, silently listening to the four of them outline their spectacular delusion. Bryce was drowning in toxic debt, desperately trying to siphon $5 million from my accounts to plug the massive holes in his failing crypto scheme. Chantel was acting like a benevolent queen, offering a peasant a crumb of her prestigious life, despite the fact that her own credit cards were entirely maxed out. My parents, having actively participated in my childhood destruction, were now trying to leverage their biological connection to facilitate the robbery of my empire. They actually thought I was stupid enough to hand over $5 million because they believed I was still desperate for their validation. They thought the traumatized 22-year-old girl they had left crying on the porch was still living inside my mind, waiting for a chance to finally be accepted by the Sterling family. They were aggressively using his white privilege and their own deeply internalized racism to convince me that building a billion-dollar empire from scratch was somehow inherently less valuable than buying proximity to an arrogant man who could not even afford to pay his own dinner tab at my restaurant. I looked directly at Bryce, staring at his smug, entitled face. Then I looked at Chantel, who was watching me with a volatile mixture of deep jealousy and eager financial anticipation. Finally, I looked at my parents, the architects of my deepest wounds, who were now sitting comfortably in my office, expecting me to thank them profusely for the privilege of being used as an unlimited cash machine. I let out a slow, measured breath. I reached forward and pressed my fingertips together, resting them lightly on the cool, smooth surface of my mahogany desk. The pure, unadulterated audacity of beggars, I thought to myself, is truly a terrifying thing to witness in real time. They were completely unaware that they had just walked willingly into the slaughterhouse and happily handed the butcher a sharpened knife. I did not yell at them for their disrespect. I did not throw them out into the hallway. I simply smiled, a cold, razor-sharp smile that made the temperature in the executive suite drop by 10 degrees. "You make a very compelling argument, Bryce," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured and entirely devoid of the disgust boiling just beneath the surface. "You are absolutely right that my hospitality group focuses heavily on tangible assets, real estate, supply chain logistics, and brick-and-mortar establishments. The complex world of decentralized finance is certainly a different arena entirely. And $5 million is, as you correctly noted, a relatively minor allocation for my current investment portfolio." Bryce's smug smile widened significantly, his chest expanding as he firmly believed he had just successfully manipulated the uneducated chef into funding his failing lifestyle. "I knew you would see reason, Kiara," he said smoothly, practically salivating at the thought of the money transfer. "It is a highly strategic business move. You stick to what you know best, the kitchens and the menus, and let me handle the high-level financial structuring. We will make a truly great team moving forward." Chantel let out a small, shaky breath of relief, her rigid posture relaxing slightly. "It is really the absolute best thing for everyone," she added, stepping closer to the edge of the desk. "You get the social elevation you desperately need, and our family finally gets to work together harmoniously. Mom and Dad have been so incredibly stressed lately, and this massive partnership will bring so much peace to the entire household." I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch again, allowing them to thoroughly marinate in their false sense of absolute victory. The sheer desperate panic radiating from them was palpable, hiding just beneath their expensive designer clothes and arrogant demands. They needed this money to survive the week, but their massive egos would never allow them to simply ask for my help directly. They had to frame the entire interaction as a transaction, where I was the fortunate one receiving the massive favor. I pressed the intercom button on my desk without breaking eye contact with Bryce. "Malik," I said, speaking clearly into the microphone, "please come back into the office and bring a standard non-disclosure agreement with the complete preliminary investment evaluation forms. Our guests are proposing a venture capital partnership, and we need to begin the paperwork." I released the button and looked back at my family. The trap was perfectly set, and they were eagerly waiting for the heavy iron door to snap shut permanently behind them. Malik walked back into the executive suite less than a minute later, carrying a stack of crisp white documents. He placed them carefully on the edge of my mahogany desk, directly in front of Bryce. I kept my posture completely relaxed, leaning back in my chair, while Bryce stared at the thick stack of papers. "In the world of high finance," I began, my voice perfectly, "even we do not simply write checks based on verbal promises and shared genetics. Obsidian Group has strict fiduciary responsibilities. If you want a $5 million capital injection from my holding company, We require absolute transparency. It is a standard corporate due diligence process. Bryce shifted uncomfortably, his arrogant smile faltering just a fraction of an inch. He looked down at the complex legal forms and then back up at me, trying to deploy his usual entitled charm. Kiara, he said, using a tone that sounded like he was explaining basic math to a toddler. We are talking about a highly exclusive crypto venture here. The proprietary algorithms are strictly confidential. I cannot just hand over my internal corporate ledgers to a restaurant accounting team. It is a massive security risk for my institutional investors. I did not break eye contact. Then I suggest you ask your institutional investors for the $5 million you are demanding from me, I replied smoothly. But since you are standing in my office asking for my capital, you will play by my rules. My financial team will audit your entire corporate structure, your operational budget, and your personal asset declarations to ensure you have the appropriate collateral to secure this level of funding. Furthermore, I turned my gaze slowly toward my parents, since Mom and Dad are actively sponsoring this pitch and presenting this as a joint family venture. I will need their complete financial portfolios as well. A joint risk profile is absolutely mandatory for any partnership of this magnitude. Yvonne immediately bristled, her defensive nature flaring up at the mere suggestion that her pristine financial facade be examined by anyone. That is completely unnecessary. Kiara, my mother, scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. Your father and I have an impeccable credit history in this city. We are highly respected members of the community. We should not have to submit our private bank statements just to help facilitate a deal for your brother-in-law. I smiled, a cold, empty smile that offered absolutely no warmth or compromise. It is a package deal, Yvonne, I said, completely dropping the title of mother. If you want the $5 million, you will sign the authorizations releasing all your financial records to Malik by the end of the day. If you refuse, the door is right behind you, and this meeting is permanently over. The quiet panic in the room was a tangible, living thing. Marcus looked at Bryce, desperation leaking out of his eyes. Bryce stared at the paperwork, his jaw clenched tight, knowing that refusing would expose his desperation, but agreeing would expose his fraud. The heavy silence dragged on, until Chantel, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation, reached over and grabbed the gold pen from my desk. She shoved it into Bryce's hand. Just sign the preliminary forms, Bryce, Chantel urged, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. It is just standard paperwork. We have absolutely nothing to hide, and getting this funding secured today is the most important thing. Trapped by his own massive ego and the crushing weight of his secret failures, Bryce forcefully signed his name on the dotted lines. Marcus and Yvonne, eager to secure the imaginary social elevation they believed this deal would bring, quickly followed suit, signing away full access to their personal financial histories. They handed the documents back to Malik, their faces glowing with a sickeningly triumphant relief. They truly believed they had successfully manipulated the wealthy but naive chef into opening her vault. They thanked me profusely, making grand, empty promises about our bright future as a unified elite family before strutting out of my office like royalty. They left the building completely unaware that they had just handed me the exact blueprint of their own destruction. It took Malik and his forensic accounting team exactly 72 hours to completely dismantle the fabricated reality my family had been living in. I was standing in the private test kitchen on the top floor of the headquarters, experimenting with a new wild-caught sea bass recipe when Malik entered the room. He did not have his usual calm, professional demeanor. He looked profoundly disgusted. He carried a thick black binder and set it down heavily on the stainless steel prep counter right next to my cutting board. You are going to want to sit down for this, Kiara, Malik said, his voice tight with disbelief. I have spent the last decade auditing distressed assets and hostile takeovers, but the sheer level of financial incompetence in these files is genuinely staggering. They are not just broke, Kiara. They are drowning in a toxic ocean of catastrophic debt. I wiped my hands on a clean towel and opened the black binder. I slowly turned the pages, absorbing the stark, devastating truth, printed in black and white ink. Bryce Sterling, the arrogant old money savior of the Washington family, was a complete and utter fraud. His crypto startup was nothing but a hollow shell company, actively bleeding cash from every single department. He had absolutely zero institutional investors. He had completely fabricated his entire pitch. I was using newly acquired investor funds to pay off older angry investors in a classic textbook Ponzi scheme that was mere weeks away from completely imploding and triggering a massive federal investigation. I flipped to the next section detailing Chantel's financial profile. The golden child, the elegant corporate lawyer who looked down on my culinary jackets, was entirely funding her luxurious lifestyle on plastic. She had opened over 15 different high-interest credit cards and completely maxed out every single one of them. She was drowning in over $200,000 of unsecured consumer debt just to buy designer bags, expensive shoes, and luxury cars she could not actually afford. She was paying minimum balances with other credit cards, desperately trying to keep up appearances for her wealthy social circle. But the most sickening revelation was hidden in the final section of the binder. The financial records belonging to Yvonne and Marcus Washington. I stared at the property deeds and mortgage statements, feeling a cold, dark fury rising up from the very bottom of my soul. They mortgaged the ancestral home, I whispered, staring at the official bank documents. Malik nodded slowly, his jaw set in anger. 3 years ago, he explained quietly, they took out a massive second mortgage on the house your grandparents worked their entire lives to pay off. They pulled all the equity out of the property and handed it directly to Bryce to bail out one of his earlier failed business ventures. They risked their entire generational wealth to save a white man who treats them like garbage. And because Bryce never paid them back, they have defaulted on the mortgage payments for the last 6 months. I closed the binder, feeling a terrifying absolute calm washing over my entire body. My parents had looked me in the eyes and demanded I give them $5 million, claiming it would elevate my social status. In reality, they were weeks away from total bankruptcy. The bank was actively preparing to foreclose on the family home and auction it off to the highest bidder. Chantel was facing complete financial ruin, and Bryce was dangerously close to facing serious criminal fraud charges. They did not come to my office to offer me a seat at the table. They came because their own table had completely collapsed, and I was the last available life raft in their sinking ship. They were fully prepared to steal my hard-earned empire to maintain a pathetic illusion of superiority. "What do you want to do?" Malik asked, watching my face carefully. "I can have our legal team a formal rejection letter right now. We can sever all contact and let the banks tear them apart. It will be over by the end of the month." I looked out the massive glass windows of the test kitchen, staring at the glittering Atlanta skyline. Simply walking away and letting the banks handle them was entirely too easy. They needed to understand the exact magnitude of their betrayal. They needed to face the daughter they threw away on a freezing Thanksgiving night and realize that she now held the absolute power of life and death over their entire existence. "No," I said softly, my voice echoing in the pristine kitchen. "We are not sending a rejection letter, Malik. I want you to contact our asset management subsidiary immediately. Have them reach out to every single bank and lending institution listed in that binder. I want Obsidian Group to quietly purchase all of their bad debt, buy Chantel's credit accounts, buy Bryce's defaulted corporate loans, and most importantly, buy the mortgage on my grandparents' house." Malik's eyes widened as the sheer ruthlessness of my strategy dawned on him. A slow, highly predatory smile spread across his face. "You want to become their primary debt collector?" he asked, his voice laced with dark amusement. "I want to own them," I corrected, turning back to the cutting board. "I want to hold the deeds to their entire fake lives. And once we secure the debt, I want you to send them a very special invitation. Tell them their investment has been fully approved and that we are hosting a private, intimate Thanksgiving dinner at my personal estate in Buckhead to celebrate the new family partnership." I picked up my chef knife, feeling the perfect balanced weight of the steel in my hand. "It is time to serve them exactly what they ordered 9 years ago," I said. Malik nodded, snapping the black binder shut. "I will make the calls immediately, Kiara. We will own their entire portfolio by Friday." As Malik walked out of the kitchen, I returned to preparing the sea bass, moving with meticulous, flawless precision. The trap was now fully set, and the bait had been eagerly swallowed. My family was happily dancing toward the edge of a massive cliff, entirely convinced they were climbing to the top of a mountain. They were expecting a luxurious high society feast to celebrate their successful manipulation of the family failure. I was going to give them a dinner party they would remember for the rest of their miserable lives. The process of acquiring the debt took less than 4 days. Obsidian Group possessed the kind of liquid capital that made financial institutions move with terrifying speed. Malik operated like a ghost in the financial machine, purchasing the defaulted mortgage on my parents' ancestral home, the toxic debt of Bryce's failing crypto, startup, and every single one of Chantel's maxed out credit cards. By Thursday afternoon, my holding company was the sole legal owner of my family's entire financial existence. We held the paper to their fake lives. Once the acquisitions were legally finalized, I set the second phase of the plan into motion. I ordered custom invitations to be printed on thick black cardstock with heavy gold foil lettering. I hired a private courier service to hand-deliver the envelopes directly to their respective doors. The invitations formally requested the honor of their presence at my private estate in Buckhead for a highly exclusive Thanksgiving investment dinner to celebrate our new family partnership. I knew exactly how they would react when those sleek black envelopes arrived. I could easily picture Yvonne crying tears of arrogant joy, convinced that her strategy of emotional abuse had finally paid out a multi-million-dollar dividend. I could see Marcus puffing out his chest, believing he had successfully brought his rebellious daughter back under his patriarchal control, and Bryce and Chantel would undoubtedly be celebrating, popping a bottle of cheap champagne they bought on credit, absolutely certain they had manipulated the naive little chef into funding their luxurious delusions. They truly believed they had won. They thought they had successfully secured the $5 million investment, and that this dinner was merely a lavish formality to hand over the massive check. They were completely blinded by their own greed, eagerly marching toward a slaughterhouse simply because the path was lined with gold. My estate in Buckhead was a sprawling modern masterpiece tucked away behind massive iron security gates. It sat on 10 acres of pristine manicured land, featuring a long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees. The house itself was a fortress of glass, stone, and dark wood, designed to project absolute power and uncompromising elegance. I spent the entire week preparing the estate for their arrival. I hired a specialized private catering staff for the evening, completely barring my usual restaurant employees from the property. I did not want anyone from Aura involved in what was about to happen. This was a private family execution, and I needed staff who were paid to be entirely blind, deaf and silent. I instructed the floral design team to construct elaborate cascading centerpieces of dark red roses and black calla lilies. I had the massive mahogany dining table set, with my finest crystal stemware and custom gold-plated cutlery. Everything was designed to feed their massive egos, to make them feel like they had finally arrived at the absolute pinnacle of high society. They needed to feel completely invincible, right before the floor disappeared beneath their feet. The evening of the dinner arrived with a crisp autumn chill in the air. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows in my grand salon, nursing a glass of sparkling water and watching the security monitors. Exactly at 7 o'clock, a rented luxury SUV pulled up to the main security gate. I watched through the high-definition cameras as Bryce rolled down the window and smugly gave his name to my armed security team. The heavy iron gates swung slowly open, and the vehicle crept up the long, oak-lined driveway. I walked to the grand foyer to greet them personally. When the massive double doors opened, my family stepped into my home, looking like a traveling circus of desperate vanity. Chantel was actually holding her phone up in front of her face, actively live-streaming her arrival to her thousands of fake internet followers. She swept her camera across my soaring 30-foot ceilings, the imported crystal chandelier, and the sweeping marble staircase. She was speaking loudly into her phone, bragging to her audience about how her little sister was hosting an intimate billionaire Thanksgiving dinner just for them. She was using my home, my wealth, and my private sanctuary as a cheap prop to boost her failing social media presence. Yvonne and Marcus walked in right behind her, looking around the grand foyer with wide, greedy eyes. Yvonne ran her hand along the edge of a custom marble console table, nodding in deep approval, as if she were inspecting a property she was about to purchase. Bryce strolled in last, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of a suit that I now knew he had not paid for. He looked at my security staff with open disdain, before turning his arrogant gaze toward me. They did not hug me. They did not ask how I was doing. They immediately scattered into my home, treating it like an open house event. I directed the silent waitstaff to guide my family into the grand salon for pre-dinner drinks. The salon featured a massive roaring fireplace and plush velvet seating arrangements. A private bartender stood ready to serve them, whatever top-shelf liquor they desired. Yvonne immediately ordered a glass of vintage champagne, while Bryce demanded a pour of my most expensive scotch. They settled into the velvet sofas, looking incredibly pleased with themselves. Chantel finally put her phone down long enough to take a sip of her drink and look directly at me. She smiled a sharp, predatory smile that made my skin crawl. "You know, Kiara?" She began, her voice echoing in the large room. "Bryce and I were talking on the ride over here since we are officially business partners now, and the family is finally back together. We think it is the perfect time to celebrate properly. Next spring marks our 10th wedding anniversary, and we are planning a massive vow renewal ceremony. We want to rent out a private island in the Caribbean and fly all of our friends down for a week-long luxury retreat." I took a slow sip of my water, maintaining a perfectly blank expression. "And how does that involve our business partnership?" I asked, my tone completely neutral. Chantel laughed, a high-pitched grating sound. "Well, obviously, we want Obsidian Group to be the primary sponsor for the event," she declared casually. "It would be amazing exposure for your little hospitality brand. We are looking at a budget of roughly $100,000. You can just add that on top of the $5 million investment check tonight. Consider it a sisterly bonus to make up for all the years you missed being part of the family." The sheer sickness of her request hung heavily in the air. She was drowning in $200,000 of high-interest credit card debt, facing total financial ruin, and she was sitting on my couch aggressively demanding that I pay for a luxury vacation to celebrate a marriage built entirely on lies and fraud. Bryce nodded in agreement, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "Chantel is right, Kia," he said, leaning back and crossing his legs. "You have done remarkably well for yourself assembling all this brick and mortar, but you still have a very raw, unpolished edge to you. This house is a bit too loud, a bit too aggressive. Your wealth desperately needs refinement. You need someone who understands the subtle nuances of old money to guide you through high society. Once we finalize the paperwork, tonight I am going to take you under my wing. I will introduce you to the right country clubs, the right political donors, and the people who actually matter in this country. You provide the raw capital and I will provide the class." I stood there looking at a man who was actively being hunted by his angry, defrauded investors, a man whose ancestral wealth was entirely fabricated, a man whose very existence was currently owned by my holding company. He was standing in my multi-million-dollar mansion, drinking my top-shelf scotch, and arrogantly offering to teach me how to be civilized. I did not scream. I did not throw my drink in his face. I simply offered him a slow, chilling smile that carried the absolute promise of total destruction. I nodded my head gently, acknowledging his profound delusion. "You are absolutely right, Bryce," I said, my voice dropping to a soft, dangerous whisper. "We definitely need to finalize the paperwork tonight." I turned away from the deeply pathetic spectacle of my family and looked at my head butler, who was standing silently by the archway. "The pre-dinner drinks are finished," I announced clearly. "Please tell the kitchen staff to serve the main course immediately." The trap was locked. The audience was seated, and it was finally time to lift the cloches. I led them from the grand salon down the long, arched hallway that opened up into my formal dining room. The space was designed to be an absolute masterpiece of modern luxury, with dark oak-paneled walls and a massive custom-built dining table carved from a single slab of black walnut crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceiling, casting a warm, expensive glow over the flawless table setting. My family walked into the room, with their heads held high, completely intoxicated by the immense wealth surrounding them. They were practically floating on a cloud of their own delusional greed. Chantel immediately raised her phone again, panning the camera across the room to show off the custom gold-plated cutlery and the imported silk napkins to her internet audience. She was making sure everyone watching knew she was about to sit down to a billionaire Thanksgiving feast. Bryce took his seat at the right side of the table, aggressively pulling his chair out and adjusting his suit jacket with a smug sense of entitlement. He looked at the intricate floral centerpieces of dark red roses and black calla lilies with a mild nod of approval, as if he were a king inspecting the tribute brought by his loyal subjects. Yvonne and Marcus sat opposite him, their eyes darting around the room, calculating the cost of every single item they could see. My mother ran her fingers over the rim of her crystal water glass, a deeply satisfied smile playing on her lips. On her lips, she was already imagining the stories she would tell her country club friends about her brilliant billionaire daughter and the massive investment they had just secured. I took my seat at the head of the long table, looking down the polished wood at the four people who had once destroyed my entire world. They were laughing together, sharing private little jokes, and leaning in to whisper about the sheer scale of my estate. They were completely relaxed, entirely certain that they held all the power in this room. The heavy mahogany doors to the kitchen swung open and my private waitstaff entered the dining room in a perfectly synchronized line. They were dressed in immaculate black uniforms, moving with the silent, practiced grace of a seasoned culinary team. Each of the four servers carried a massive, gleaming silver cloche resting on a polished silver tray. The visual impact was exactly what my family expected from a 3 Michelin star chef hosting a private elite dinner party. Yvonne gasped softly in delight, her hands clasping together under her chin. "Oh my goodness," she whispered loudly enough for the whole room to hear. "This is simply exquisite, Kiara. You really have learned how to put on a proper show. I am so incredibly proud of how far you have come." Bryce leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table. "Bring it on," he said with an arrogant smirk. "I have been eating generic country club food all week, and I am absolutely ready to see what a billion-dollar chef can actually do in the kitchen." Chantel positioned her phone to capture the grand reveal, eagerly narrating the moment for her live stream. "We are about to be served the first course at my sister's private estate," she cooed into the camera. "Wait until you see the kind of luxury we are dealing with tonight." The waitstaff stopped precisely behind each of my family members, standing in perfect unison. They lowered the heavy silver trays onto the table, placing a domed cloche directly in front of Yvonne. Marcus, Chantel, and Bryce. I sat at the head of the table with nothing in front of me, just a glass of water and my cold, steady gaze. I gave the head butler a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of my head on my silent command. The four servers reached down, grasped the polished handles of the silver cloches, and lifted them straight up into the air in perfect synchronization. The heavy silver domes were whisked away, revealing the highly anticipated first course. My family leaned forward eagerly, their mouths practically watering as they expected to see white truffle caviar or perhaps a perfectly seared piece of Wagyu beef sitting on my expensive fine china. Instead, they saw something that made their brains completely short-circuit. Sitting directly in the center of their pristine white plates were cheap, clear plastic Tupperware containers. They were the exact same brand, the exact same size, and the exact same flimsy material as the container. My mother had violently shoved into my hands 9 years ago on a freezing Thanksgiving night. The plastic looked incredibly jarring and violently out of place, sitting on top of the imported gold-rimmed plates under the glittering light of the crystal chandeliers. There was no gourmet food inside. There was no artistic plating, no steam rising from the dish. There were just four cheap plastic boxes sitting in absolute dead silence. The waitstaff immediately turned and marched out of the dining room, leaving my family staring down at the table in profound, suffocating confusion. The heavy silence in the dining room stretched out for what felt like an absolute eternity. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just stared at the cheap plastic containers, as if an alien spacecraft had just landed in the middle of my dining table. Chantel's phone was still recording, but her hand had slowly dropped her perfectly manicured nails, trembling slightly as the confusion began to curdle into genuine embarrassment. She quickly ended her live stream setting, the phone face down on the black walnut table with a sharp clack. Yvonne was the first one to finally break the silence, her face twisting into a mask of deep irritation and profound offense. She looked up at me from the other end of the table, her eyes darting back and forth between my calm expression and the plastic box sitting on her fine china tiara. "What on earth is the meaning of this?" my mother demanded, her voice sharp and grating, cutting through the quiet elegance of the room. "Is this supposed to be some kind of avant-garde culinary joke? Because I have to tell you, it is in incredibly poor taste. We are your guests, we are your family, and we came here for a formal investment dinner, not to be mocked with cheap supermarket plastic." Bryce let out a harsh, humorless scoff, shaking his head in obvious disgust. He pushed his chair back slightly, crossing his arms over his chest. "This is exactly what I was talking about earlier," he sneered, looking at me with undisguised contempt. "You can buy all the expensive real estate in the world and hire all the fancy staff you want, but you still have no idea how to conduct yourself with any actual class serving your investors. A plastic box is a massive insult. You are trying to be edgy, but you just look completely unrefined if this is how you treat your business partners. I am seriously reconsidering allowing you to buy into my tech company." Marcus chimed in, nodding along with his arrogant son-in-law and trying to project a sense of paternal authority that he simply did not possess. "Kiara, this is highly inappropriate," he scolded, his voice taking on that familiar, disappointing tone he used to use when I was a culinary student begging for his validation. "Your sister is right. We came here in good faith to finalize a $5 million partnership agreement, and you are playing childish games. Remove these absurd boxes from the table immediately and tell your kitchen staff to bring out the actual food. We do not have time for this nonsense." I sat at the head of the table completely motionless. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my actions. I simply looked at the four of them, letting their aggressive complaints wash over me like a gentle breeze. They were so deeply blinded by their own towering egos that they still believed they held the high ground. They truly thought they were scolding a misbehaving child rather than speaking to the architect of their total destruction. I slowly leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, and let a cold, vacant smile touch the corners of my mouth. "This is not a joke," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm register that instantly silenced their complaints. "And I assure you, Bryce, this is the most refined course you will ever be served in your entire life. The dinner I promised you is sitting right in front of you. All you have to do is open the boxes." Chantel looked at the plastic container with absolute revulsion, as if it were crawling with disease. She tentatively reached out her manicured fingers, hesitating just inches from the plastic lid. "I am not opening this garbage." She spat, her voice trembling with rising panic. "I do not know what kind of sick psychological game you are trying to play, Kiara, but I am not participating. Open the boxes." I repeated the command, cracking like a whip across the large room. My tone left absolutely no room for negotiation or argument, slowly, reluctantly driven by a dark, morbid curiosity they could not suppress. My family reached out and grabbed the edges of their respective Tupperware containers. The sound of the cheap plastic lids snapping open echoed loudly in the quiet dining room. One by one, they pulled the lids back, expecting to find some sort of twisted culinary creation or perhaps a bizarre art statement. But there was no food inside the boxes. There was no smell of roasted turkey or candied yams. There was only the crisp, dry scent of freshly printed legal paper, sitting neatly folded inside each plastic container were thick, heavy stacks of official financial documents. The bright white paper glared under the crystal chandeliers, contrasting violently with the cheap plastic holding them, and stamped across the top of every single page in bold, bleeding red ink were words that completely stopped their hearts from beating: default, foreclosure, acquired, frozen, liquidated. They stared down into the boxes, their eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror as their brains desperately tried to process the information printed on the pages. Yvonne's hands began to shake so violently, she dropped the plastic lid onto her plate. Marcus leaned closer to his box, his mouth falling open as he recognized the official seal of his mortgage lender stamped directly under my holding company's logo. Chantel let out a small, suffocating gasp as she saw the header of her credit card statements printed with a zero balance transferring ownership to Obsidian Group. and Bryce, the arrogant, untouchable old money heir, stared down at the complete itemized ledger of his fraudulent crypto scheme officially acquired and locked by my legal team. The massive illusion they had spent years building, the fake wealth, the country club status, the elite superiority. It all dissolved into ash right in front of their eyes. The heavy silence in the room returned, but this time it was not born of confusion, it was born of absolute crushing terror. They slowly lifted their heads and looked down the long black walnut table at me, the realization finally crashing down on them with the force of a falling building. I was not their naive little sister. I was not the family failure asking for a seat at their table. I was the owner of the table, and I had just served them their entire ruined lives on a silver platter. I watched them stare at the crisp white paper, their eyes scanning the bold red letters of their own financial executions. The crushing gravity of the moment descended upon the grand dining room like a suffocating blanket pressing down on their chests, pulling the air directly out of their lungs. The crystal chandeliers above us seemed to shine even brighter, casting sharp, glittering reflections off the polished black walnut table and illuminating every single terrified micro-expression on their faces. They were completely paralyzed, entirely trapped in a nightmare of their own making, reading the official bank seals and the undeniable proof of their catastrophic failures. I placed my hands flat on the smooth, dark wood of the table and slowly pushed myself up to a standing position. The soft scraping sound of my chair moving backward was the only noise in the massive room, echoing against the oak-paneled walls. I stood tall at the head of the table, looking down at the four people who had spent my entire childhood making me feel incredibly small and entirely worthless. The power dynamic in the room had fundamentally and permanently shifted, placing me on an untouchable throne while they sat trembling in the dirt. I turned my attention to Bryce. First, his face was completely drained of blood, his arrogant old money posture entirely collapsed, leaving him looking like a pathetic, frightened child trapped in a suit he could not afford. I spoke with a voice that was perfectly calm, terrifyingly steady, and completely devoid of any human sympathy. I told him that I knew exactly what was hiding inside his failing crypto startup. I detailed every single fraudulent transaction he had made, every desperate attempt to move imaginary money around to cover his tracks, and every angry institutional investor who was currently hunting him down for their missing funds. I explained how his desperate, aggressive demand for a $5 million investment in my office earlier this week was not a generous offer to elevate my social status, but a pathetic, incredibly transparent attempt to plug the massive bleeding hole in his personal Ponzi scheme. I told him that I knew his ancestral wealth was a complete fabrication and illusion he used to intimidate people who actually worked for a living. I watched his eyes widen in pure terror as he realized that the uneducated chef he had constantly mocked and belittled was currently holding the absolute proof of his federal financial crimes, and that his entire existence as a respected businessman was officially over. Then I shifted my cold, relentless gaze to my sister Chantel. She was gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table, her knuckles completely white, her breathing shallow and erratic. The expensive designer dress she was wearing suddenly looked like a cheap, desperate costume, wrapping a woman who was drowning in her own vanity. I broke down the exact magnitude of her fake life, reciting the massive overdue balances on her 15 different maxed-out credit cards. Without breaking eye contact, I mentioned the $200,000 of unsecured consumer debt she had recklessly accumulated just to buy luxury shoes, imported handbags, and status symbols to impress high society. Women who did not actually care about her. I watched her perfect, flawless facade crumble into absolute dust as I casually listed the late payment notices, the threatening calls from collection agencies, and the impending repossession orders for the luxury vehicles parked in her driveway. She had built her entire identity, her whole reason for living, on being completely superior to me, on being the elegant, successful lawyer who married into old money, and now everyone sitting at the table knew she was nothing but a broke, desperate fraud, drowning in a toxic ocean of plastic debt and superficial lies. Finally, I looked directly at Yvonne and Marcus, my parents, the architects of my deepest childhood wounds. They were visibly shaking in their velvet chairs, their eyes wide with a horrific realization they could not escape. I did not raise my voice, but every single word I spoke hit them like a physical blow to the chest, forcing them to confront the ugly reality of their own actions. I asked them how they could possibly justify mortgaging the ancestral family home, the beautiful house my grandparents had worked their entire lives to pay off, just to hand that precious equity over to a white man who openly despised our culture and viewed us as nothing more than a convenient bank. I laid out the brutal timeline of their 6 months of missed mortgage payments, the desperate red-stamped notices from the lending bank that they had deliberately ignored while desperately trying to maintain their elite country club memberships and their fake wealthy appearances. I told them that their obsessive toxic need to appear elite to their high society friends had actively cost them the only real tangible wealth this family had ever actually owned. They had thrown away their legacy to chase a phantom, and now they had absolutely nothing left to their names. The heavy silence that followed my words was profound. They were completely paralyzed, entirely trapped by the devastating pinpoint accuracy of my knowledge. They looked at me with a pathetic mixture of profound horror and begging desperation, still desperately clinging to the incredibly fragile delusional hope that because we shared blood, I was going to use my billions to magically wipe away their colossal failures. They actually thought I had gathered all this deeply private financial information simply to scold them, to punish them emotionally, before handing over a massive bailout check to save the family name. They were sitting there waiting for the maternal intervention, the unconditional family loyalty, the beautiful forgiveness that they had absolutely never once offered to me when I was starving and freezing in a Chicago studio apartment. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the crisp autumn air of my private estate fill my lungs, feeling the immense satisfying weight of the empire I had built entirely on my own. I looked down the length of the beautiful table at the cheap plastic Tupperware boxes, ruining my flawless place settings, the exact visual representation of how little they had valued my existence. And then I dropped the final bomb, the absolute checkmate that would sever their lifelines forever. I told them that the banking institutions had grown completely tired of their constant excuses, their missed payments, and their endless financial shell games. I explained that last week, all of their respective financial institutions had aggressively packaged their bad loans, their defaulted mortgages, their fraudulent corporate debts, and their catastrophic credit card balances, and sold them all off to a private asset management firm for pennies on the dollar. I watched Yvonne swallow hard, a glimmer of panicked confusion crossing her tear-stained face as she tried to understand the corporate jargon and what it meant for her immediate future. I leaned forward, resting my palms flat on the table again, bringing myself closer to them so they could feel the absolute freezing certainty radiating from my soul, and I delivered the final execution. I told them that the private asset management firm that had aggressively bought their entire miserable financial existence was a direct subsidiary of the Obsidian Group. I watched the color completely drain from their faces as the words fully registered in their minds. I told them that I did not bring them to my private estate to evaluate a business partnership. I did not invite them into my home to give them a $5 million investment. I told them that I brought them here because my holding company was the sole legal owner of every single dollar they owed. I brought them here because I am your primary debt collector. The absolute devastation that washed over their faces was a breathtaking masterpiece of human emotion, the crushing, profound realization that the daughter they had thrown out into the freezing night with $400 was now the undisputed legal owner of their entire lives. Hit them with the force of a freight train. They could not breathe. They could not speak. They were completely at my mercy, sitting at my beautiful table, drinking my expensive wine, while physically holding the legal documents of their own destruction inside the exact same cheap plastic boxes they had used to discard me 9 years ago. The irony was poetic, closing a circle of trauma and betrayal with a perfectly orchestrated display of absolute dominance. They were drowning, and I was the one holding the anchor, watching them sink beneath the weight of their own greed and entitlement, entirely free from the chains they had tried to bind me with. The absolute silence in the dining room shattered like a fragile pane of glass dropped from a skyscraper. Bryce lost his mind completely. The refined Southern gentleman facade he had weaponized against my family for nearly a decade evaporated in a single second. His face contorted into an ugly, twisted mask of pure venomous rage, and his pale skin mottled with dark, furious red blotches. He realized in that exact moment that his entire life of unearned privilege had just been completely dismantled by a black woman he had viewed as entirely beneath him. He slammed his fist down on the polished black walnut table so hard the crystal wine glasses violently shook and tipped over, spilling dark red wine across the pristine white linen tablecloths like fresh blood. He started screaming that I was a liar, screaming that he was going to destroy me, screaming that his family would bury me in endless litigation. He turned his aggressive wrath onto Chantel, calling her incredibly degrading names, blaming her for bringing him into this pathetic, worthless family, and screaming that she was the reason he was facing federal prison. Chantel shrank back into her velvet chair, raising her hands to protect her face, completely paralyzed by the terrifying monster she had married just to secure a fake position in high society. Bryce was completely out of control, a cornered animal realizing the trap had closed permanently. His delusion, fueled by a lifetime of unchecked white privilege, made him believe he could still intimidate me with physical violence. He let out a guttural roar and lunged across the wide expanse of the dining table, his arms outstretched, his hands reaching aggressively toward my throat. He knocked over the cheap plastic Tupperware containers, sending the devastating legal documents scattering across the spilled wine. He never even made it halfway across the table. My security team moved with the lethal, terrifying speed of trained predators. Before Bryce could even extend his fingers toward my custom suit, two massive men in immaculate black suits descended upon him from the shadows of the room. They grabbed him by the shoulders and the back of his neck, pulling him roughly off the table and slamming him violently onto the hard, polished floor. The sound of his body hitting the ground echoed with a heavy, sickening thud. One guard drove a knee firmly into the center of his back, while the other swiftly twisted his arms behind him, pinning him to the floor with absolute, uncompromising physical dominance. Bryce struggled frantically, thrashing and screaming obscenities into the hardwood, but he was entirely powerless, pinned under the crushing weight of men who took orders strictly from me. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I just looked down at him, writhing on the floor of my dining room, looking exactly like the pathetic fraud he truly was. The violent takedown of the man they had worshipped as a savior broke whatever tiny shred of sanity my mother had left. Yvonne let out a loud, suffocating wail that tore through her throat. The fierce, controlling matriarch who had ruled our childhood home with an iron fist completely dissolved. She slid awkwardly off her luxurious velvet chair, her legs giving out beneath her, and collapsed heavily onto her knees, right there on the floor of my dining room. She began to weep with a frantic, hysterical desperation, crawling forward on her knees until she reached the edge of my chair. She reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grasp the fabric of my trousers, but my security team instantly stepped forward, forming an impenetrable wall between me and the woman who had birthed me. Yvonne stayed on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks, her perfect silk dress pooling around her on the floor. "Kiara, please," she wailed, her voice cracking under the weight of pure, absolute terror. "Please, my beautiful baby girl, you cannot do this to us. We are your family. We are your blood. I am your mother. Kiara, please have mercy on us. I am begging you for family mercy. We made a mistake. We were stupid and blind, but you cannot destroy us like this. Please do not take everything away from us." I looked at the woman on the floor, weeping for mercy from the daughter she had emotionally starved for decades. It was a pathetic, repulsive display of manipulative grief. She was not crying because she felt remorse for abusing me. She was crying because she was finally facing the consequences of her own actions. Marcus, my father, the man who was supposed to protect me, was shaking so violently his teeth were actually chattering. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his eyes wide with a hollow, vacant fear. He looked at the foreclosure documents scattered on the table and then looked at me, his voice nothing more than a pathetic, trembling whisper. "Kiara." He stammered, a single tear rolling down his aged face. "Are you really going to do this to us? Are you going to kick your own parents out onto the street? Are you intending to make us homeless? We will have nothing left, Kiara, nothing at all. Where will we go? I remained perfectly still, an immovable statue of cold, calculated retribution, sitting at the head of $1 billion empire. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the electric current of absolute justice. I looked at Bryce, pinned to the floor, gasping for air. I looked at Chantel, frozen in her chair, completely ruined. I looked at Marcus, shaking like a coward. And I looked down at Yvonne, begging on her knees for a mercy she had never once extended to me. 9 years ago, I said, my voice cutting through the sounds of my mother's, hysterical sobbing like a velvet blade. 9 years ago, I stood in the hallway of our home and begged you to see me. I begged you to let me sit at your table. I spent my last dollar and cooked for 8 hours to prove my worth to you. And you looked me dead in the eyes and told me I was too loud, too cheap, and too much of an embarrassment to sit with your elite family. You stopped me at the door and you left me a plastic box of cold scraps on a freezing porch. You threw me away, Marcus. You threw me away, Yvonne. You chose an arrogant racist fraud over your own flesh and blood because you wanted to pretend you were rich. I stood up slowly, towering over my mother, who was still weeping on the floor. Today I continued the icy calmness of my tone, terrifying them more than any screaming ever could. Today I am simply returning the favor. I did not create your debt. I did not force you to mortgage your ancestral home. I did not force Chantel to max out her credit cards. And I certainly did not force Bryce to commit federal financial crimes. You dug your own graves out of pure, unrelenting greed. I just bought the shovels. I gestured to Malik, who stepped forward holding a sleek silver pen and a new stack of heavily stapled legal contracts. These documents inside your plastic boxes are not just notices of your absolute failure, I explained. They are asset transfer agreements. Your bank accounts are empty, your credit is destroyed, and you are completely insolvent. But you do still have a few pathetic assets left. Chantel has her luxury cars and her designer wardrobe. Marcus and Yvonne, you have the remaining equity in the home you ruined. Bryce, you have the remaining technical patents of your hollow company. I looked at each of them, watching the last flicker of hope die completely in their eyes. You have two choices right now, I told them, delivering the final absolute ultimatum. You can pick up that pen and sign over every single remaining asset you possess to Obsidian Group to legally clear the staggering debt you owe me. You will leave this estate with exactly what you gave me 9 years ago, absolutely nothing. Or you can refuse to sign. And if you refuse to sign, I will personally execute the foreclosure and bankruptcy proceedings on Monday morning. I will hand Bryce's fraudulent ledgers directly to the federal authorities. You will not just be homeless. You will be publicly investigated, publicly ruined, and entirely stripped of the fake elite status you sacrificed me to maintain. The silence returned heavy and suffocating, broken only by the ragged breathing of my broken family. They realized with a crushing, terrifying finality that they had absolutely zero leverage. There was no negotiation, there was no maternal manipulation that could save them from the corner they had painted themselves into. They were completely trapped by my wealth, my power, and my unyielding memory of their cruelty. Marcus broke first. The proud patriarch, defeated and hollowed out, reached across the table with a shaking, trembling hand. He took the silver pen from Malik and pulled the asset transfer agreement toward him. Tears fell freely onto the crisp white paper as he signed his name legally, signing away the house his parents had built, signing away his cars, his savings, and his entire fake legacy. He dropped the pen as if it had burned him and buried his face in his hands, weeping silently into the dark wood of the table. Yvonne slowly pulled herself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the table for support. She looked at me one last time, her eyes searching desperately for the little girl she used to control, but she found absolutely nothing but a cold, empty void. She picked up the pen, her hands shaking so badly she could barely form the letters, and signed her name next to my father's, surrendering her entire life to the daughter she had called an embarrassment. Chantel did not cry. She just stared dead-eyed at the table, completely stripped of her golden child armor. The realization that she would be returning to a minimum-wage retail life, that she would lose her luxury bags, her status, and her arrogant husband had entirely broken her mind. She took the pen and signed the documents, giving me legal ownership of everything she had bought to make herself feel superior to me. Bryce was the last to sign. My security guards hauled him up from the floor, keeping his arms firmly restrained behind his back. Malik placed the document on a clipboard and held it directly in front of Bryce's bruised and red face. They freed one of his hands just long enough for him to grip the pen. He glared at me with a look of pure, unfiltered hatred, but the terror of federal prison was much stronger than his pride. He signed the contract legally, handing over the hollow shell of his fraudulent company and transferring his massive toxic debt permanently to my ledger. The moment the final signature was complete, I gave a short, sharp nod to the head of my security detail. "The dinner is over," I announced, my voice echoing with finality in the grand dining room. "Escort them off my property immediately." The security team moved with swift, relentless efficiency. They grabbed Bryce by the arms, dragging him forcefully toward the grand foyer. Chantel stumbled after them, her designer heels clicking frantically on the marble floors as she followed the man who had ruined her life. Marcus placed a trembling hand on Yvonne's shoulder, guiding his weeping broken wife away from the beautiful dining table they would never sit at again. They were marched down the long arched hallway past the expensive artwork and the crystal chandeliers and pushed out the heavy double doors into the cold, dark autumn night. The massive wooden doors slammed shut behind them with a heavy echoing boom, locking them permanently out of my empire and out of my life forever. The fallout was exactly as swift and merciless as I had promised it would be. When Monday morning finally arrived, the federal authorities descended upon Bryce Sterling's fake corporate headquarters like a swarm of angry locusts. The Internal Revenue Service, alongside federal investigators in dark windbreakers, raided his offices, seizing his servers, freezing his remaining dummy accounts, and physically carrying out heavy cardboard boxes filled with fraudulent financial records. Bryce, however, was not there to see his kingdom fall. The moment he was violently thrown out of my estate, he knew the illusion was completely dead. He did not go back to comfort his wife. He did not stay to face the music or accept any accountability. He packed a single leather duffel bag, drained whatever loose cash he could find, hidden in his house, and completely fled the state, leaving Chantel to answer the front door when the federal agents came knocking to seize their remaining assets. Chantel, the golden child, the elegant corporate lawyer who had built her entire existence on looking down at me, was left completely abandoned to face the catastrophic wreckage of her fake life. The bank immediately repossessed her luxury vehicles, towing the expensive cars right out of her manicured driveway, while her wealthy neighbors watched in hushed horror from behind their curtained windows. She was forced to sell every single designer bag, every pair of expensive shoes, and every piece of jewelry she owned just to afford a basic defense attorney to protect herself from her own implication in Bryce's massive financial crimes. The staggering legal fees completely wiped out whatever tiny scraps of dignity and savings she had left. Within 2 short months, the bank foreclosed on her sprawling mansion, leaving her with absolutely nothing. Her prestigious law firm, deeply embarrassed by the massive public scandals surrounding her fugitive husband, quietly let her go without a severance package. She was entirely unhireable in the corporate world to survive. My sister was forced to take a minimum wage retail job at a discount department store, wearing a cheap, scratchy polyester uniform, and standing on her feet for 8 grueling hours a day. She spent her days scanning barcodes and folding cheap sweaters, serving the very same working-class people she used to openly mock and despise. The destruction of my parents' fabricated high society life was equally absolute and utterly devastating. The foreclosure on the ancestral home executed precisely on schedule without a single ounce of mercy. They watched in streaming tears as the bank officially changed the locks on the beautiful house. My grandparents had worked so hard to build their exclusive country club memberships were immediately revoked. Their names quietly scrubbed from the elite social registers they had dedicated their entire lives to climbing. They were forced to pack whatever meager belongings they could fit into a rented moving truck and relocate to a tiny run-down one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The walls of their new home were thin. The neighborhood was loud, and the luxury they had sold their souls to maintain was permanently gone. Marcus, who had once walked with the arrogant swagger of a respected patriarch, aged a full decade in a matter of weeks. He spent his days sitting in a cheap recliner in a cramped living room, staring blankly at a stained wall, mourning the total loss of his fake legacy and the utter destruction of his pride. But Yvonne simply could not accept defeat in silence. Her towering narcissistic ego demanded that she remain the center of attention, even in her absolute ruin. Unable to accept that she was the sole architect of her own destruction, she attempted to deploy her favorite weapon. One last time, she turned to social media, taking to Facebook to post a long, weeping, deeply dramatic statement. She played the ultimate victim, painting a completely fabricated picture of an ungrateful, evil billionaire daughter who had swooped into town to ruthlessly steal her elderly parents' home. She begged the Black elite community of Atlanta for sympathy, claiming, "I was a heartless monster who had abandoned traditional family values for pure corporate greed." She wrote about how she had sacrificed everything to raise me, and how I had repaid her love with unspeakable cruelty. The post began to gain rapid traction, racking up sympathetic comments and shares from her country club friends who were completely unaware of the actual truth. She truly thought she could control the narrative one last time, just like she had always done when I was a child, but she had completely forgotten who she was dealing with. I did not respond emotionally. I did not post a reactive video, crying about my childhood trauma or trying to defend my character. I simply gave a single phone call to my public relations and legal teams at Obsidian Group. Within exactly 2 hours, my corporate team released a heavily redacted but completely undeniable dossier of financial receipts to the public. We legally released the official mortgage transfer documents proving that Yvonne and Marcus had willingly and secretly handed the entire equity of their ancestral Black-owned home directly to an arrogant white scammer. We released the fraudulent investment contracts they had eagerly signed in my office, attempting to steal $5 million from my holding company to bail out Bryce's criminal enterprise. We showed the world exactly how they had actively conspired to rob their own successful Black daughter, just to protect their proximity to white wealth. The public backlash was instantaneous, and it was absolutely glorious. The very same Black elite community that Yvonne had desperately worshipped turned on her with a fierce, unforgiving vengeance. The socialites who had initially offered their fake sympathy publicly denounced her, expressing profound disgust that she would betray her own flesh and blood for a known con artist. Group chats and high society forums exploded with the undeniable proof of her betrayal. They were completely exiled, permanently banished from every single social circle, church group, and community organization in the city. They became absolute pariahs, their names synonymous with toxic greed and ultimate betrayal. They had tried to publicly shame me, and instead they had permanently locked themselves in a cage of profound social isolation where nobody would even look in their direction. Exactly 1 year later, Thanksgiving night arrived in Atlanta. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint, familiar scent of wood smoke and approaching winter. I was not standing in a cramped residential kitchen, desperately trying to cook a massive feast to earn the conditional love of people who despised me. I was standing on the expansive private rooftop garden of Aura, my flagship 3 Michelin star restaurant. Looking out over the glittering, sprawling skyline of the city, I had conquered. The towering glass skyscrapers glowed warmly against the dark night sky, reflecting the immense power and wealth that pulsed through the streets below. The restaurant below me was closed for the holiday, giving my entire staff the day off to be with their families and loved ones. The rooftop was completely silent, save for the gentle, distant hum of the city traffic. I walked slowly to the edge of the thick glass railing, placing my hands on the cool, smooth surface and looking out at the massive empire I had built with my own 2 hands. I closed my eyes and took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the crisp autumn air. I searched deep inside my heart, looking for any lingering traces of the traumatized 22-year-old girl who had cried on that freezing porch a decade ago. I looked for the anger, the heavy, suffocating sorrow, the bitter resentment that had fueled my grueling nights scrubbing pans in Chicago kitchens, but I found absolutely nothing. The dark, heavy weight of my past had completely evaporated, leaving behind a vast, beautiful, empty space. There was no anger left in my blood. There was no sorrow in my chest. There was just pure, unadulterated, absolute peace. I had survived the raging fire and I had forged myself into something completely unbreakable. The toxic tumor of my biological family had been surgically permanently removed from my life, and the wound had healed beautifully, leaving a faint scar that only served as a reminder of my own immense strength. I did not miss them. I did not pity them. I simply did not think about them at all. They were strangers living in a different world, breathing a different air entirely irrelevant to my daily existence. The soft sound of footsteps on the wooden deck broke the quiet stillness of the rooftop. I turned to see Malik walking toward me, emerging from the shadows of the rooftop garden. He was wearing a relaxed, tailored dark coat, a stark contrast to his usual strict corporate suits. He carried two tall crystal flutes and a bottle of incredibly rare vintage champagne that cost more than my parents' current annual rent. His face carried that same sharp, knowing smile that had been by my side since the very beginning of this monumental journey. He stopped beside me, resting his elbows on the glass railing and looking out at the city lights alongside me. He popped the cork on the champagne with a soft, quiet sigh of escaping pressure and expertly poured the bubbling golden liquid into the heavy crystal flutes. He handed one to me, the cool glass feeling perfectly solid and grounding in my grip. The quarterly reports came in this morning, Malik said, his voice low and smooth, carrying the easy, comfortable rhythm of a man who knew he was standing at the absolute top of the world. Obsidian Group has officially crossed the $2 billion valuation mark. The new properties in Miami and Nashville are outperforming their projected revenue by 15%, and the supply chain distribution network is completely dominating the entire southern market. We are officially untouchable, Kiara. I looked down at the bubbling champagne, watching the tiny golden spheres rise to the surface and burst into the cool air. I thought about the journey, the endless blistering hot shifts, the burned hands, the lonely nights, and the absolute refusal to ever let anyone make me feel small again. I had taken the absolute worst things they had given me, the rejection, the cruelty, the abandonment, and I had spun them into pure solid gold. We built a fortress, Malik, I said softly, my voice carrying across the quiet rooftop. We built a fortress where nobody can ever tell us we do not belong. Malik nodded slowly, clinking his crystal flute gently against mine, a soft musical chime that rang out into the crisp night. We built an empire, he corrected gently, and we built it entirely on our own terms. I raised my glass, holding it up toward the glittering city skyline, offering a silent tribute to the universe, to the struggle, to the pain, and to the ultimate beautiful victory. I thought about that cold plastic box of leftovers sitting on the welcome mat, a pathetic, insulting scrap meant to keep me in my place, meant to remind me that I was not worthy of a seat at the table. They had no idea that they were handing me the exact fuel I needed to burn their entire world down and build my own universe. From the warm ashes to the cold plate of leftovers, I said, a genuine warm smile spreading across my face, the smile of a woman who had won the ultimate war. The plate that birthed an empire to the empire, Malik echoed, taking a slow, satisfied sip of the vintage champagne. We stood there together in the quiet, peaceful chill of the Thanksgiving night, two self-made titans looking out over the city that belonged entirely to us. The past was completely dead, the debts were fully paid, and the future stretched out before me, bright, limitless, and totally under my personal control. I took a sip of the champagne, letting the crisp, bright taste wash over my tongue, feeling the absolute perfection of the moment. The camera of my life slowly pulling back, lifting up into the night sky, capturing the glittering lights of the restaurant, the towering skyscrapers, and the woman who had conquered it all, fading slowly and beautifully into absolute black. The most profound lesson from Kiara's journey is that your worth is never determined by those who fail to see it, even if they are your own family. Rejection, while incredibly painful, can be the ultimate catalyst for your greatest transformation. When people who are supposed to protect you hand you scraps, you have the absolute power to walk away and build your own table. True success isn't just about financial wealth, it's about reclaiming your narrative, establishing unbreakable boundaries, and thriving on your own terms. You never need anyone's permission to build an empire out of their underestimation. If this story of reclaiming your power resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more empowering content, and let me know in the comments how you've set boundaries to protect your own peace.